Hey guys, welcome back to the sculpture. Today in the sculpture we're going to be working on the shoulder and the upper arm and the lower arm. Let's talk about the deltoid to start out. Every muscle's got an origin and an insertion, and in the deltoid the origin is very broad. It wraps around the entire shoulder, and from the back, which is the posterior, the origin is the spine of the scapula. And in the front, the anterior, is the lateral clavicle. And of course, the deltoid inserts into one particular spot called the deltoid tuberosity. That's almost midway on the humerus. It's slightly above midway. And if you see skeletons, you can see a rather interesting bump in the humerus where the deltoid tuberosity is. It took me a while to figure that out when I was studying anatomy. So my model was rather muscular, and his deltoid doesn't look like most people's deltoid, and he was rather sinewy, so you could see the various strands of the deltoid. Another thing I'll say about the deltoid, it's got a couple of heads that oftentimes are seen in people who work out. The anterior part, the medial part, and the posterior part. And in my model, all of these parts are very well defined. Bodybuilding photos are great to look at when you're studying anatomy because you want to see the very distinct heads. On this model, you can plainly see where the various sections of that muscle, like the anterior and the medial. Usually after I develop the various portions of the muscle, I like to take my shop towel and kind of just blend them together. It's also important not to smooth things out too much. Often I'll go with a shop towel in there, and then I'll just take one of my wooden tools and I create a little bit more distinction to the muscles, because part of the sculpture is having very defined muscles. You can plainly see the clavicle in the direction of the clavicle. Remember, the deltoid attaches to the lateral clavicle. Now, my sculpture looks kind of wimpy, so I have to add a little bit to the triceps. As the name implies, there's 3 heads to the triceps. This is the long head of the triceps, and underneath of it, towards the olecranon or the elbow, that's where you find the medial head. This little dot represents the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Very important to indicate wherever there's a bone meeting the surface of the skin that you can see it. I would use that as reference instead of any muscles, because muscles tend to change as the model moves around. But if you can define the bones, it's really much more important. This diagram explains where the triceps are. There's the lateral head, the long head, and the medial head. Those are the ones that normally artists concentrate on. Always be sure to keep your clay nice and wet, especially like in arms or anything that comes out and is not connected to the body. It tends to dry out. There is a slight bump here, which is a tendon. It's the tendon of the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. And that's basically the triceps, the long head. My model had such little fat that that tendon was visible. After I indicate the muscles, I like to use my scraping tool and kind of just blend them together. The triceps tendon is pretty visible. It gets flattened out as it goes towards the olecranon process. The olecranon is basically just like saying elbow. And the olecranon, of course, is part of the ulna. As you work out, you get some pretty nifty neck muscles, and this is the sternocleidomastoid. And I'm not going to concentrate on any neck muscles yet, but that's going to be another video. I really want that medial epicondyle of the humerus to come out, and I don't want to make it too smooth. I think that's one of the problems I see in sculptures, and in my sculptures at least, is that I made it way too smooth. Also, when you look at it from this vantage point, it is just too wimpy of an arm when you consider the guy's torso. So you have to make sure that everything blends in together that way. Part of the upper body is the biceps here that I'm adding, and this is towards the end, towards the elbow, but there's two heads to the biceps, as the name implies. There's the short head and the long head, and I'm sculpting the short head at this point here under the arm. And of course there is quite a distinction between the triceps and the biceps. There's a furrow that runs right down the arm that creates this very distinct shape. Now, the lower arm looks pretty wimpy for a guy that works out 24/7, so let's put some muscles on him. And our model's particularly veiny, but I don't know if I want to include all the veins. What do you guys think? Probably not. It doesn't look very attractive. Oftentimes when I'm thinking about the lower arm, I think of the flexors and the extensors. And the extensors are on the back of the hand, and the flexors are on the palm side of the hand. Either way, the lower part of the arm deserves a video of its own because it's so complex. There's so many things happening, and as our hands rotate from side to side, these muscles shift. So when you're looking at anatomy books, it's a little bit difficult to realize what you're looking at least for me, it's always been that case. But what I look for is where the thumb is and where your little finger is. That's going to indicate where the ulna and the radius is, and that way you can connect all the muscles just from those two indications. This is the Brachioradialis, and it's kind of funny when you learn anatomy, you'll learn a little bit of Latin. The name brachio is basically arm in Latin, and radialis, it means you can rotate. It also flexes the forearm at the elbow, and it's also capable of rotating from side to side. So it's a muscle that a lot of people have in their arms that's very, very strong. And normally when you have bodybuilders and people who work out a lot, that muscle is very prominent. In this sculpture, working on the lower arms is a little bit tough because the lower arm creates some support for the sculpture because it is connected to the body. That arm is supporting a lot of weight. Also keep in mind that the humerus shouldn't be looking kind of bent, and you have to work on your sculpture from various points of view. And oftentimes people work on sculptures just from one point of view and they never go to the other side. From this point of view now, I can see that my arm is completely way too thin. Compared to the muscles of the deltoid, you cannot have a person like this that has tiny little arms because one works out the other. Oftentimes I'll spend quite a bit of time working on where the bones come to the surface. I find bones in the surface a little bit more interesting to look at because they give you so many clues of what's happening. We're not going to get into the shoulder blade today in this video. If you're learning anatomy, the shoulder blade is extremely complex, and I think it can overwhelm people. The best thing you can do when you're studying anatomy is to compartmentalize things into little sections. The most important thing to note with the shoulder is finding the spine of the scapula. This is very important because if you are drawing, painting, or sculpting, knowing the direction that this is going to really help you lay out the muscles later. Knowing the direction of the scapula here, I know what muscles are underneath of the spine of the scapula and the ones that are above it. Directly below the spine of the scapula is the infraspinatus, and infra just means below. And of course, above that spine of the scapula is the supraspinatus. Now, these aren't that noticeable, but it's important to note and know that they're there. The infraspinatus is pretty distinct on this model, and there is a muscle between the infraspinatus and the teres major, which is the teres minor, and even on this model, that is oftentimes helps to draw exactly where that scapula is. So in addition to the muscles of the scapula, we have muscles that are covering the scapula on top, like a sheet. Right here is the latissimus dorsi, and at this point it's a very thin muscle in the back. And above that is the trapezius. The trapezius is this diamond-shaped muscle that covers the scapula. This is the shape of the trapezius. It's going to be coming down towards the middle of the back. And I want to use my tools to create a seamless effect. But right now, of course, the sculpture is very rough. You have to keep in mind that I work fairly slow. I'm trying to work a little bit faster, but with this armature, it's a very sensitive armature. I'm doing this all freestanding without something underneath to really like support it, so I can't really manipulate it that fast. Well guys, that's it for today. I am going to be working on the back in a later video. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.